Manchester United are considering legal action against Ronaldo. So let's now speak to a sports lawyer, Stephen Taylor Heath. Stephen, good afternoon to you. Look, United are now considering their options. What are those options?
Good afternoon. Well, the first thing they will do is they will look at the contract. The contract itself is in a fairly standard form, and it sets out the rights that the club have in relation to responding to conduct which they consider brings the club into disrepute or employees of the club. They will probably be obtaining senior King's Counsel's advice with an opinion as to whether that conduct amounts to gross misconduct, because the procedures under the employment contract are different depending on whether it reaches that threshold or it's simply a disciplinary matter.
Well, let's get to the nuts and bolts of it then, because obviously he's been very critical of the Glazer family, which of course are his employers. Would that, do you think, be enough to sack the player?
Well, as you've alluded to in your report, there's a lot of noise as to external factors that will play a part in how the club reacts to this matter. But in terms of the actual legal advice, it really just depends on the threshold as to whether the comments bring the club into disrepute. The fact that he's attended an interview without presumably telling the club that he was attending this interview, that it's not a personal promotional matter. He's appearing there still in the guise of being an employee of the club. And so his comments, if they reflect badly on the club, then the club will decide what's a proportionate way of responding to that from a legal sense. And then, having obtained that legal opinion, they will then factor that into how they wish to respond from a commercial and a footballing sense.
So obviously he was fined 2 weeks' wages, wasn't he, for refusing to come on against Tottenham. Do you think they can use things, you know, historically against Ronaldo? Would that might be a case in point?
Yes, if they go down the route of asking him to attend a disciplinary hearing, bearing in mind he's currently abroad at the World Cup, then they will consider his previous misdemeanours as to whether or not there is a pattern of behaviour here that effectively amounts to grounds for dismissal. But then, once they've formed a view as to whether or not there are grounds for dismissal, if they were to sack him for gross misconduct, for example, he would have a certain period of time in which to appeal. If he did appeal, then the matter would go before the Premier League procedures in relation to dealing with that dispute. If, however, they don't sack him on the spot for gross misconduct, then they may have a disciplinary hearing, and it may be that they will negotiate a settlement agreement, which effectively they would then announce that it's termination by mutual agreement. But they will also have to factor in whether or not they actually want to terminate his contract at all. And as you say in the report, if he's seeking to engineer a departure from the club, then are they effectively falling into his trap by sacking him?
Yeah, I see what you mean. So I guess throughout this whole period, they have to continue paying him. Is there any situation where they wouldn't have to continue paying him?
Well, if they do dismiss him and he does appeal, then they can suspend him and wouldn't have to continue paying during that period. But as I say, that's in circumstances where they dismiss him for gross misconduct. If they don't think that the conduct amounts to gross misconduct, but nevertheless they feel it's a disciplinary matter. And we have to bear in mind that if they don't take any action, if another player comes out and says things that are regarded as detrimental to the club, and then that player's lawyers would say, well, you didn't take any action in relation to Cristiano Ronaldo, why are you allowed to take action in relation to my player? So they may be seen to have to do something about this.
Yeah, I guess you're saying sort of they're almost setting a precedent, so it's really interesting to see how they deal with this situation and going forward. Look, he has a huge following, we know that. What do you think this might do to his image rights? Could that strengthen United's hand at all?
Well, players at the level of Cristiano Ronaldo, they don't just have an employment contract, they don't just have a playing contract. What they do is they split the commercial rights and the playing rights so that he will have a separate image rights contract, and the amount of money that they're paying him will be split between the playing rights and the image rights. So they will have to look at the grounds on which they can terminate the image rights contract as well. If he's not playing, then of course they're not getting the benefit of his playing services. That's stating the obvious, but he is still a commercial force to the club, and sponsors want to use him in commercials. People still want to buy his shirt, but obviously if basically he's ostracised by the club, then those commercial rights immediately nosedive, and they will have to look at the grounds on which they can terminate the image rights contract, which at the end of the day is a commercial contract, not an employment contract.
Okay. Now, obviously, we've got to look at it from his point of view as well. He said he felt betrayed by the club. What are his rights as an employee then?
Well, it's not just his rights as an employee. He obviously has a right of freedom of speech, which is in the Human Rights Act. So he does have the right to speak his mind. However, he is obviously an employee of the club. But his rights as an employee are, if the club takes disciplinary action against him, then he can appeal against the action that is taken against him. He always has a right of appeal. If they have a disciplinary hearing, then he will be able to hire the best lawyers who will basically be able to frame his appeal against the decision that's taken against him. If he's dismissed for gross misconduct, then he will appeal and take it through the Premier League's processes. Whether Cristiano Ronaldo would wish to take it that far in terms of appealing against a decision against him, he will also have to factor in the effect of a dismissal on him with regard to the overall picture, with regard to him potentially being a free agent in the next transfer window, which is not something that's a usual parameter for an employee to have to consider.
No. Just finally then, you know, in your experience, you're talking about disciplinary hearings, you're talking about appeals. What would be the time frame for a case like this? You know, could this be resolved quickly or could this drag on?
Well, the lawyers will be being very careful. I believe that at this moment in time, we've only had snippets of the interview. The interview itself is to be published in full. I don't believe there's any application for an injunction to stop the interview going ahead. So they will have to study the full interview, and then they will have to give advice to the club, and then the club will act. If the club were to terminate his employment for gross misconduct, you would expect them to act quickly. If they're going to hold a disciplinary hearing, then that hearing has to be convened at a time that Ronaldo is available, and it may be unreasonable to ask him to come back during a World Cup for that interview, for that disciplinary hearing. So it may be that it'll get drawn out after the World Cup if the club don't decide that the threshold is so high with regard to his conduct that it justifies termination for gross misconduct, and the club wants to terminate. At the same time, there could be negotiations going on between the respective legal advisors as to whether a settlement can be reached and his employment is terminated by mutual agreement.
Look, I did say finally, but you said something at the beginning of that. I just want to pull you back on that. You just said that they could potentially put out an injunction to stop the interview from being broadcast. Is that right? How would that work? Could you just talk us through that?
Well, if they were to make an application for an injunction, they would have to effectively say that the damage caused to the club by the full interview was so great that the club wouldn't be able to row back on the position with regard to a claim for damages. But it's most unlikely that the club is going to go down that route. But obviously, if there's comments in relation to the interview which are basically untrue, then significant damage could be done by publishing untrue remarks. And so in the same way that if somebody is going to publish an untrue article about somebody, you may seek to have an injunction to stop that article going ahead. You could, in theory, seek to obtain an injunction in relation to this interview, but it's unlikely that in the time frame available that they would do that. And the question is, if he's voicing his opinion, then he's not really stating matters of fact. He's basically just expressing his opinion. And if he holds that opinion, he holds that opinion.
I hear what you're saying. Stephen Taylor Heath, it was a fascinating interview. Thank you very much for joining us.